Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Sarah Moriarty. I'm Executive Director of Charleston Literary Festival, and it's an honour to welcome you all to today's session that sees Pulitzer Prize winning writer Jayne Anne Phillips in conversation with her publisher of over 30 years, Anne Close. Before we begin, I'd love to ask you all to turn off your cell phones or any noise-making devices. Thank you very much. I'd also like to tell you all that our work at Charleston Literary Festival is possible thanks to the generosity and the vision of our sponsors. So I'd like to take a moment to thank the sponsors of this event, Tom Taft and Kathleen Paramore. Today's event is extra special as we have the honour of hosting one of the most important living writers in the United States in conversation with their longtime publisher. There's a special relationship between writer and publisher, an intimacy in relation to the work, and to have the opportunity to eavesdrop on their recollections and thoughts on a book that, they reminded me backstage, they worked really hard on for 8 years is a real privilege and a treat. So let me please start by introducing Anne Close. Anne Close is a giant in the world of literary publishing. She was a senior editor at Knopf Publishers for over 50 years, where she published fiction, literary non-fiction, and poetry. The writers she has worked with include Alice Munro, Norman Rush, Gish Jen, Jay Cantor, Steve Harrigan, and Brad Lighthouser. It's no exaggeration to say that Anne Close's work has shaped many of the now classic works of literature and writing that have contributed to our modern canon. These are works known and loved and pored over by all of us, and they all owe a due to the canny eye and editorial expertise of Anne Close. Anne Close is the recipient of a Roger Klein Award for Editorial Excellence. Anne Close is also a stalwart in her defence of a liberal arts education. In an address she gave at her alma mater, Randolph College in Virginia, she said, "I've been in publishing now for 50 years, and the death of the novel and of books has been prophesied regularly, as I'm sure they have been almost since Gutenberg, and they still survive. And I suspect liberal arts education will as well. It's too essential to every part of our lives." Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome literary publishing giant Anne Close. And that brings me to Jayne Anne Phillips. Jayne Anne Phillips, an American novelist and short story writer from Buchanan, West Virginia, who has been dubbed one of the greatest and most intuitive living American writers by the New York Times, and the best short story writer since Eudora Welty by Nobel Prize winner Nadine Gordimer. Jayne Anne Phillips' first book of stories, Black Tickets, published when she was 26, won the prestigious Sue Kaufman Prize for First Fiction from the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters. Jayne Anne Phillips has since wrote another short story collection and 6 novels, including her first, Machine Dreams, which was nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award and chosen by the New York Times Book Review as one of the best books of the year. Then came Shelter, which was awarded an Academy Award in Literature by the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters, followed by Motherkind, which won the Massachusetts Book Award and was shortlisted for the prestigious Orange Prize in the UK. Her 4th novel, Lark and Termite, was a finalist for both the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award. And her 5th novel, Quiet Dell, was chosen by Publishers Weekly and the Wall Street Journal as a best book of the year, which brings us to her 6th novel, which is the novel at the heart of today's conversation, Night Watch. Night Watch is a mesmerizing story about a mother and daughter seeking refuge in the chaotic aftermath of the Civil War. The book was awarded the 2024 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. The book was lauded as epic, enthralling, and meticulously crafted, a stunning chronicle of surviving war and its aftermath. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming one of the most accomplished American living writers, Jayne Anne Phillips, in conversation with her longtime editor, Anne Close. I promised I'd take a photo.
She's all set.
Okay. Jayne Anne Phillips' extraordinary novel, Night Watch, is set in West Virginia during the Civil War and the years afterwards. The Wall Street Journal has said about it, not only serendipity, but a kind of clairvoyance connects its characters. Goodness is a real thing in this novel, a verifiable force, and the questions posed is whether we still have the sensitivity to discern it. An editor is almost always surprised by an author's next project, with a little fear and trembling every now and then. And I certainly was when you told me you were writing a novel about the Civil War. How did the idea occur to you, and how does goodness play a role?
I think the reality of goodness comes out in the book, in the characters' lives, and in the way they continue to protect one another. I actually began writing as a poet. I published a few poems, but I've always been a language-oriented writer, and I find my way into a novel via the language itself. I found myself writing Connolly's voice, and she was in the midst of this rushed, chaotic situation, being hurried into a buckboard with her mother by a man she's been told to call Papa, on a journey she can't control or understand. And as the author, I didn't know where Night Watch was going either. So I basically began that journey with her. I want my books to have that kind of organic structure, to evolve from the characters themselves rather than to have a story imposed from the outside. I feel as though the story should evolve, and in that way, it remains alive and full of surprises. I wanted this book to continue to have revelations all the way to the end. And if you've read it, you know that that happens. And that some things that you read in the beginning appear very differently when you might read them a second time once you finish the book.
I have to say, I was stunned when I read the first pages, surprised, wonderfully surprised and stunned. The book, the beginning of the book, we are introduced to the novel's central character, Connolly, and immediately enter into the world of this novel.
Well, since these words were my first glimpse into the book, I'm going to read for about 4 or 5 minutes. This is the very beginning of the book. I've taken a lot out because I want to get to a certain point. But it begins here. Connolly, A Journey, April 1974. I got up in the wagon and Papa set me beside Mama, all of us on the buckboard seat. Hold her hand there, he said to me, like she likes. Sit tight in. Keep her still. I saw him lean down and rope her ankle to his. Talk to her, he said. Tell her she'll like it where she's going. A fine, great place like a castle with a tower clock. Tell her. You'll like it, Mama, I said. Tell her about them palms. Palm trees in pots, Mama, and velvet sofas like in a city hotel. And don't call her Mama, he said. Don't you see how she's dressed? He'd got the dress from a widow man who was giving away his dead wife's carpet bag and clothes. The petticoats, silk underthings, the skirts, satin bodice and jacket. You know what to call her, he said. Don't fail in it. You said call her Miss Janet, though it's not her name. It is her name now. Her old name won't do her good. Call her by her name. I will, just in a minute, catching my breath. But I put my hand on hers. She was clasping her knees so hard I could feel her shake. I was out of breath from carrying the babbies to the neighbor women. One of them would take the boy because he was walking and talking, and the boy twin if she got both boys. The other woman would take the girl twin, so that was a separate trip, pulling the drag with the bags of flour and salt. I guess we were going to be gone some days, driving over to Weston. Papa, who's going to feed the chickens while we're gone and find the eggs? That neighbor woman, he said, that took the girl twin. Mama never named the babbies. We only called them so, the babbies, and she nursed all 3. The twins weren't but 12 weeks. Talk to her, Papa said, like I told you. We were moving along a bare hill, and the fields, as far as I could see, were flat and chopped. Someone had burned them, cleared the crop, burned and not harvested. Some mite or fungus could eat a crop and leave a poison for the next. Farmers burned it all with torches. Some days ago, but there'd been no rain to take the smell. Charred popcorn it smelled like, dirt damp, a soil smell coming up and mist and dew on the singed air. The road emptied along through it, dusty, yellow with moon glow. Puts me in mind of the war, Papa said. Mighty lonely when it's burnt and dead, far as you can see. It's how we did it, burned them out. And they burned us out, I said. That they did, he said, but they never found you back along that ridge. I didn't say they had found us, and more times than I knew. Mama would hide me in the root cellar, once with a handful of carrots she ripped from the ground as we ran. Don't come out no matter what until I fetch you. And she dropped me in. She told me, when she was still talking, never to tell about the war. No matter who won, it didn't do to say what had happened. The secessionists lost, I knew, and the abolitionists won, but they were all ragged, drifting men. That little cabin, Papa said, deep in the cover. Nothing level for any farm at all. I don't know how you managed. Mama had a bigger garden, I said, in patches, all along, 2 cows and more chickens. And Dervla took the buckboard to town and sold her roots and tonics. I told you not to speak of that old woman, Papa said. Just to say, Mama wasn't like she is now. That a fact, you said. Well, sometimes the strain eases and what's held together falls apart. Good thing I come by when I did. The sound of the wagon groaning along was a lull. Whenever I tried to think on it, I couldn't remember when he did come home. I knew of a homecoming picnic at the church with banners in the trees, maybe around that time, but that was not it. We never went near church after he come. He'd named Mama to suit himself, called her Mrs. before she was Miss Janet, and said my name wrong, Connolly, instead of Connolly. Just after dawn, we stopped, and I sat up. Papa had braked the buckboard on a wide dirt road. A railroad track lay to one side, then a thin run of stream in the back of the town. To the other side was a great lawn. It was first light, and the stone walls looked more blue than gray. There was the clock tower, and above it a spire like a church. No cross, only a point. Didn't I tell you, Papa said, 200 feet tall. It's a wonder, I said. Should I walk with her inside? She's not going in without you, he said. Then he put the reins aside and fixed me in his gaze. Connolly, how old are you? He should have known, but I told him. I'll be 13 at the end of December, born after you went away. Born in 61, he said, the year both sides mustered troops. Tall for your age, but right puny. Too skinny for a man to take on. I considered it, but you'll stay with her. Here? This is home. There's nothing back there. It's all giveaway. It's giveaway? Are you listening to me? Yes, sir, I said. He leaned down and pointed his finger at me until he touched my throat, just at the little notch of bone. Then listen, he said, I'm not your papa, nor have I ever been. I never laid eyes on you or your mama till I came upon you, and you don't know my name. It was true. She had never called him a name. Only at first he bade us call him Papa, and she never said different. So don't be looking for me, he said, or tell anyone where you come from. I only rode you here as a kindness. You was walking along the road, and because she's a quality woman and need a refuge, I rode you here. It was on my way. Tell me so. You rode us here, I said. It was on your way. Miss Janet is a quality woman, he said, with no dependents nor family. You are not her family, but a servant. Nowhere to go but with her. Sir, I said. Times is hard, he said, and flicked the reins. You'll tell the story. The wagon was moving off, and his words drifted back with the dust.
You can see why I was stunned. Night Watch switches back and forth in time. And why did you choose 1874 to start and move back to 1864?
Well, you have to imagine 1874 was only 9 years after the end of the war. Connolly doesn't really remember the war. In fact, as you read her, you realize that she's not exactly a reliable narrator. There are things that she forgets. things that have been blocked out, things that maybe she has blocked out. But I wanted us to enter a time that is the aftermath of what really happens when a nation has a war on its land. There are wars going on right now, like chaos, the displacement, the mass migrations, the lack of resources. So we're thrust into this book in this aftermath in which people are still struggling to survive. At that point, I wanted to go back into the war itself in 1864, and I wanted to show the reader what has happened to these characters to make them the way we are when we meet them in the book in 1874. And someone said to me once, you know, when I read you, I don't feel as though I'm reading a book. I feel as though I'm inside the book. And that's the effect I'm always trying to do for the reader. I feel as though fiction is almost like time travel. And though history tells us the facts as the victor writes them, literature tells us the story. And human beings are narrative creatures. We think in narrative. And sometimes we learn so much from the story of a real historical event. I made up the characters, their thoughts, their perceptions, what happens to them. But the research for this novel was extensive. And I'll stop there so that we can go on to the next question.
Well, she was saying some of what writers do, but another thing they do is anchor their books in real places. And here, one of the largest anchors is the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. So why did you choose that, and what important role does it play in the book?
There was a real psychiatrist named Thomas Story Kirkbride that some of you may know about. At this time in history, every state was encouraged to build a huge insane asylum for its populace. These insane asylums were all patterned after Thomas Story Kirkbride's plans. The way that they were built, their fire systems, they were meant to all be on 200 to 300 acres of land that were self-sustaining. And he believed in an approach called moral treatment, which we'll get into a little more later. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was only about 20 minutes from my hometown in West Virginia. And we knew it as a terrible place, a terrible overcrowded place. But it was built, it started being built in 1852. It was the only thing Virginia ever did for the frontier, which they called West Virginia at that time. The first building was built when the Civil War broke out. The North immediately came in and stole all the money to finish building the asylum. And in fact, the North held that territory for most of the war. But the reason that it's so important to the book is that my research revealed that it was a very, very different place when it was under Kirkbride's control. And he was trying to implement this system of moral treatment. The irony at the heart of Night Watch is that the war years and post-Civil War years were brutal and chaotic for the populace. Yet the asylum actually did provide refuge and caring. So that flipped world is part of what the book is about.
In earlier days, novels often contain illustrative art and drawings. But you seldom see that anymore. You have returned to this lovely custom in several books now. Could you comment on and even show us some of the photographs, images, and documents that appear throughout the novel?
Well, now I'm going to need some help here. I'm so excited to show you these images. These are some of these. This is, of course, the incredible cover of the book, which Anne really fought for. It's almost like a metaphor for the book. It almost, this line that goes through almost looks like a map or the journey that this buckboard is taking. And of course, the buckboard, it's a very important thing in the book, the constant travel that the characters do. And that building in the back is meant to represent the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. So we could advance. See the people here over at the edge? This gives you a sense of the scope of the building. It went on along the ground a quarter of a mile, and it enclosed, can you hear me? You can hear me. It enclosed 9 acres of interior space. And yet, the little legend isn't showing here on the slide, but it says, asylum built for 250 patients. Kirkbride's main rule was that there would never be more than 250 patients in this entire complex. Each had their own room with 2 windows and a transom. So part of it was clean country air, good food, removal from the family, and each person had a regimen that he assigned. So there was some talk therapy involved, and the patients went to breakfast in the morning. You can advance. Now here you see a kind of architectural drawing, and you remember I was saying that there's a railroad and a stream, and then the great lawn. And this was a true picture of the very beginnings when they began to plant all the trees. And then in the back, there's hills, and there were acres and acres of walking trails segregated for men and women. Part of your regimen would be to take a walk of 3 to 5 to 7 miles a day. He believed that gardens, fountains, plants were extremely important. You can advance. This is the actual door of the asylum then and today. There's a scene where Connolly knocks on the big black door. This is that door. You can advance. Now, this is a real picture of about 1880. You see the rooms were on the sides and the hallways were very, very wide. And these arches appeared and they're painted sky blue. And we can advance. This is a reconstituted picture. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum is now something called TALA.org. It's a nonprofit. And they endeavored to remake the first building, the entrance building, in the way that it really was in about this period of time. So you see the pale yellow color, the blue arches, the rugs, the sort of centers for conversation on both sides. The treatment for women might include taking sewing or conversation or art lessons or badminton, imagine, any sort of thing. So we can advance. Now this is, to me, such a beautiful photograph. I went to the Trans-Allegheny Asylum several times and took photographs on the tour. And this is one of the rooms that I photographed from, a chain across the door. And it just struck me that this is the room that Connolly and her mother first come to. And this, one of the things, the yellow pillow and the yellow drapes are mentioned, that this is the room that was given to a gentle lady who died in the asylum. And that is her altar, and that altar is described in Night Watch. Okay, we can advance. Now this is the dining room. You really begin to get a sense of the respect afforded the patients. With these, the dining room cloths and the napkins and the food very fresh. This is the women's dining room. The men's dining room was located somewhere else. As the wings of the building went back, you had the more and more disturbed patients. They needed to earn privileges to be able to eat here. But that photograph just always amazed me. Okay, we can advance. This is the kitchen. A lot goes on in the kitchen in Night Watch. But these are the milk cans that are mentioned. And you see the back there? the way that is the door to the outside, and these huge windows, even in the kitchen, there's so much light. You can advance. Now here are the summer houses, which were rebuilt every summer from the local forest. And you see the asylum in the background with the clock tower. There's a character named Weed in the book, who is one of 3 or 4 children that the cook, Mrs. Hexam, takes care of, who more or less live in the kitchens. And he has quite a lot to say about these gentlemen here in the summer house. Advance. This is one of the pictures that Anne really loved, because we had so many photographs, and I had to keep cutting them out. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how hard it was to put this book together with the photographs and the prose.
Well, when we put photographs in books, we more or less try to get a photograph to be within 2 pages of when it's, something is mentioned. But Jayne Anne really wanted them to come right after she had described something. So the designer, there's a designer for every book, and the designer and I had quite a deal trying to get these pictures in. But we did. They all fit. The text runs right up to the picture and then follows. It was fun, and they certainly, enhanced the book, I think.
Anne fought for that for a long time. But these are the nurses. This play is part of a particular scene as Connolly and her mother Eliza are coming back from a walk kind of further into the book. And these nurses in the novel are watching the gentleman's foot race. But this is the way, if you go to the Trans-Allegheny Asylum today and take the tour, the people who walk you through are wearing something like this. So you can advance. Now, this is a very special picture for me. This is something from Godey's Ladies magazine. These magazines were popular in the 1800s. And for Connolly and Eliza, who are living in a very modest, redone shack in the tops of the Allegheny Mountains, this has been ripped out and sort of stuck on a nail on the wall. And her mother refers to it as thee and thine. And Connolly always thinks of it as a time in the future when she and her mother might be dressed this way, in these beautiful gowns in front of that velvet curtain, and her mother is giving her a kind of message. So the book works with that metaphor. Next. Now, this is an interesting list. This is from the documents about the asylum, and it lists the reasons that someone might be committed in the post-war years. Everything from death of sons in war to fell from horse in war. And there are millions of female diseases and problems. Time of life, mental excitement, novel reading. Okay, let's go to the next one. Here we get a little closer. Shooting of daughter, uterine derangement under time of life. There's also quite a lot about masturbation, tobacco and masturbation. Political excitement, politics. We can relate to that. Religious enthusiasm. Okay, let's go on. Now we have a moment here. This is also a very important picture. This is the Bloody 7th West Virginia Cavalry, who fought for the Union. Of course, West Virginia was a border state, but it always bothered me that I would meet educated people who did not know that West Virginia seceded from Virginia to fight for the Union. And that's a sort of a major thing in the book. Now, this photograph is so amazing. It's an outdoor, unposed photograph. Each man, his aspect is so different. And I think one reason I really do research intensively and look for photographs is that they really inspire me. And I felt early on that this character is my character in the book. Dervla's adopted son, who goes by many names in the novel, and who never stops working, trying to find his way back to his true self. Let's see, one more maybe? Now, this is the hospital in Alexandria, Virginia, where the character who is known as Sharpshooter during the war, this man I just pointed out to you, he has a terrible injury. And by luck, he arrives at this hospital, which was a beautiful hotel in the beginning. And like many of the hotels and buildings in Alexandria were changed into a hospital, it was the main Union hospital. And this is a stockade that was built for military reasons. And there's a scene in the book in which Dervla comes by buckboard in search of her adopted son, who is in this hospital, but no longer remembers who she is. So that's a very important picture for me. Next one. Now, research into the asylum and research into the war were very, very intensive activities. I wanted to pick one battle that was very important, and this is from the Battle of the Wilderness. The Battle of the Wilderness took place May 2nd to 5th, 1864. And at that time, just as I do now, there were journalists embedded with the troops whose only job, they didn't have cameras, was to draw illustrations of what was happening in the war. Now, the Battle of the Wilderness was a particularly terrible battle. 29,000 people died. It was a stalemate. Lee sort of coached Grant, pulled Grant into battle. It was his first battle as commander. In a forested glade of several miles that was so bushy with briars and tiny trees that be 6 to 8 inches around and planted so close that a man could not walk forward. They had to go sideways, which meant that the battle was basically hand-to-hand combat. And there was so much gunpowder in the air that at one point the air exploded and there was a terrible fire. And I got my idea for the way that I play that scene from Wad's illustration. His name was A.P. Wad. Excuse me. Here you see 4 soldiers carrying an injured soldier away by attaching a blanket or something to the bayonets of their rifles. Next one. Okay, stop. I think we'll take that off for now. Let's go back to the... Perfect.
Well, that was really wonderful. There are pictures I've never seen blown up like that.
Right, aren't they amazing?
They're
amazing. Big.
We had kind of little scratchy things from some from the Library of Congress that you could barely make out. You've already told us a little bit about who Thomas Story Kirkbride was, but you haven't explained what his idea of treatment was, and it called moral treatment.
Well, I was very lucky that Thomas Story Kirkbride, the real person, his middle name was Story. Now you remember that Papa, as he rides off, says, "You'll tell the story." So I created a nephew of the real Thomas Story Kirkbride, and his name is Thomas Kirkbride Story. He has been mentored by his uncle, and he comes to take control of the Trans-Allegheny Asylum 2 or 3 years before Connolly and her mother arrived there. And he is bringing his uncle's moral treatment to the facility and changing quite a few things. When Connolly and Eliza first arrive, they have a kind of interview with Dr. Story, as he's called. So this is this interview. Dr. Story is basically speaking with Connolly because her mother is mute at this moment. And Miss Janet has no family? Dr. Story asked. No children? She has no children, I managed to say. Far as I know, no one mentioned such. She was always called Miss Janet. It may be she was betrothed, but so many went to the war. He interrupted me. Miss Connolly, there is clearly a bond between you. I would like to employ you as Miss Janet's attendant, to share her room and look after her. But I can pay you only in room and board for the present. Dr. Story, I told him, I want to stay very much. On a trial basis, he said, this must be understood. You see, Miss Connolly, a strict regimen, including physical activity, a walk of some 3 to 5 miles a day, croquet or hoops on the lawn, carriage rides in late afternoon is essential. For women, sewing, embroidery, sketching in pastels. I nodded, wondering if he would discover who my mother really was. I did not know truth from memory myself anymore. She'd shot deer, killed and dressed them, always with Dervla. I remembered them working in brimmed hats, leather gloves to their elbows, pulling, cutting. Slide of steaming guts tumbling out on the ground and the carcasses hung up. I heard the crack of a rifle in the woods, the thud of running, scuffling near my hiding place, smelled the earth of the root cellar. I pushed at the cool stones set in the walls and did not know why. But Dr. Story was speaking. His voice gathered me in. You will see, Miss Connolly, he said. We provide firm, sympathetic structure, healthy air and food, a refuge from family and strife. Our approach is known as moral treatment. Many can be cured with humane treatment, and the incurable treated humanely. It seemed a riddle, but the interview was over.
You've mentioned that Night Watch is the third in a trilogy of war novels that includes Machine Dreams and Lark and Termite. Can you speak to this?
I've written books between those books. I mean, I really feel that all of my books are a continuum, that one would not have been written before the one before it was written. As though I'm working with my own set of archetypes. Mothers and daughters, brothers and sisters, the sense of a really primal physical world. But when I wrote Machine Dreams, of course it's my generation's trauma to carry was the Vietnam War. And that was my first novel. It was, of course, the war between, it was a civil war between North and South Vietnam. And later, I was visiting my hometown, and I had a friend who had a garage apartment above a stone alley. And several little homes were facing this little alley. And in front of one of them, a boy was sitting in a 1950s lawn chair. He was sitting on his legs as though he couldn't feel them, and he was holding a strip of a long blue plastic dry cleaner bag in front of his eyes and blowing on it continually so that it was moving. And I said to her, "Who is that and what is he doing?" She said, "I don't know, but he sits there all day." So that was Termite. And the 1950s lawn chair somehow launched me into thinking about the Korean War. And that, of course, was another civil war between North and South. in Korea. And after I finished that book, I began to think about, these two foreign wars that America was so involved in. Korean War being a kind of precursor, I think, lessons we didn't learn for the Vietnam War. And I started to think about our own Civil War and feeling that I must go there and try to make a book about what it was like to live at that time. So I call these 3 books my war trilogy. And I hope someday they'll be published by Everyman Library in a set. Now, don't tell anyone I said that.
I'm retired now. Names, namelessness, secrecy about names, even a succession of names that one character is called happens in Night Watch. Can you tell us what is behind this phenomenon?
Well, it was funny. There was a men's book group who read my book, and they said, we couldn't tell who was who. Why didn't you just name the character in the beginning? Well, there's a very good answer for that. Names, namelessness, secrecy about names is a running theme throughout the book. Names matter. I mean, today, to remind ourselves of someone who is victimized, we might say his name or say her name. If a force is trying to dehumanize you or other you, they will not use your name. They will take your name away. If you're a prisoner, they assign you a number. Yet, if you want to stay hidden, your name can always be used to find you. Despite his changing name, Dervla and her adopted son are very strong, resilient characters. The Greek philosopher Archimedes said, "Give me a fulcrum and I can move the world." And I think there are always those nameless, forgotten individuals, never remembered in history, who are moral fulcrums in their own times, no matter what loss or threat they suffer. Dervla is such a person, as is her adopted son, even though his identity shifts as he inhabits one role after another. He continues to try to protect, to try to move forward. Now, Night Watch is his position in the asylum. But even before the war, the family keeps its past secret for reasons that spool out in the novel. Now, I want to go to that last slide. If you ever are in Amsterdam, you must go and see this painting. It's Rembrandt's painting, painted in 1642, and it's called The Night Watch. I mean, here you see these men dressed in these amazing cloaks and collars in this massive, moody portrait. They almost seem to be in a kind of cavern. Each is the night watch of his city. So it makes me think about night watch as a concept. I mean, taking the night watch around a campfire at night, or as a parent during the night with a sick child, is a moral and physical necessity. It's comprised in one man in night watch, a man who is secret even to himself, the reader discovers, whose nature it is to protect and defend, to survive, to thrive if given a chance. So I feel as though this title, Night Watch, speaks not only of the book itself, but to all of us, that we need to be the night watch for our families, for our communities. No one else will do it for us. And I guess I'd like to leave you with that thought before we take questions.
That's right.
Thank you.
We ask that you raise your hand if you want to ask a question. and somebody will come to you with a mic. We like questions that end with a question mark. And let's get started. Anybody ready to?
Yeah, you can stand up.
Yeah. Just first of all, thank you for being here. It's such a thrill. You speak about the fact that you didn't know where Night Watch was going when you first wrote it, and you have a beautiful dual timeline at the same time, and I think it is a wonderful structure to go on this journey of almost self-discovery with your characters. My question is, as a writer though, how did you engage with those two timelines? Did you write the story chronologically and then edit it? Did each timeline sort of come to you in and of itself at different moments? If you could just give us a little peek into that process. Thank you.
Well, I had a very hard time writing this book. I wrote the beginning, and then for myself, I needed to go back 10 years earlier to know what had happened to each of these characters. And I really was following them. It's not like automatic writing at all, I don't mean that. But I felt as though their stories were inside them, and I needed to discover what they were. And I take the reader with me into some very deep traumas, because I think we all experience trauma, and that damage can be a killing thing, or it can become a form of knowledge. That some characters are resilient enough to go forward, and they solve and work through their damage over the next 10 or 20 years of their lives. Because the book is very much about trauma, the trauma of the war altogether, the trauma of the distances created by the war between people, and the trauma of actual experience and how healing happens. So that was not an idea, but it was a way for me to understand what had happened to each of them. And then it took me a little while after I got to that point to understand where the end of the book was going.
And somebody else? You see your hand?
Can you make the connection, please, between the proliferation of asylums for the insane and the destruction and loss of the Civil War, and also the idea of refuge? That, I mean, did some people go there who were not, in fact, insane, but had lost family members and needed a place to be?
Did everyone hear the question? People did not go there simply because they were in need of help. Everyone was in need of help. But they went there for some reason that was certifiable. I mean, you saw some of the reasons, but a man kicked in head by horse. They didn't really know that that was why. I mean, could be why. Certainly novel reading never drove anyone crazy. But people had some kind of symptom. I mean, Eliza was mute. She had stopped speaking because of what had been happening to her for the past 2.5 or 3 years. And as you see in the book, there is a kind of way of interviewing the people who come in. They have to be from that state. But Kirkbride and Kirkbride's nephew were very different in that they believed that a person could recover from a mental trauma and go home and yet maybe need more help later. They could relapse. They could go back to the asylum if they needed more help. So it was a very, very different way of thinking about mental illness. And of course, it was followed by terrible overcrowding. I mean, Kirkbride died. His methods fell out of favor. Very different methods began to come into play, including lobotomies and, terrible things. And then suddenly there was a movement, as you know, that all of these asylums were emptied and people were simply sent out of them, even though they may have lived there all their lives. So that's an important thing to remember, that this is a moment of grace, in a way, inside this asylum within the book. Question there?
Thank you. Can you hear me? You started out by saying you did not know where this book was going in the beginning. Did you have in mind the asylum when you started the book?
I did have in mind the asylum. I knew when I started that that's where they were going. But I didn't know what was going to happen once they got there. And the asylum, becomes its own kingdom, in a sense. The people who work there, the people who worked there before moral treatment became the method of treatment, their relationships, was all a kind of world that grew up around writing about it, going there, reading about it, getting sort of more and more inside the characters themselves. I mean, to begin with, I think writers have to have quite an ear. When the book first started, I felt as though somehow I had found a way for them to speak to each other that was believable for the time. And then, of course, once you begin even a really wonderful novel, you have the problem of sustaining it, sustaining the voice, sustaining your original passion throughout the book. And there was a time that I kind of didn't know how the book was going to end. And that was when the pandemic started. And I retired from my academic job. And the book became my refuge. It became a way for me to look at a past that had somehow managed to move forward. So that it goes way forward in the end. And I'm not going to say any more about that because I don't want to spoil it. But despite the fact that so many difficult things happen, so many people experience these life-altering traumas, it's a very hopeful book, I think.
I think so. I do.
Question there?
Can you talk a little bit about Dervla and her role in it? She seems like a mother figure and a refuge for Connolly and Eliza, and carries through the books kind of as the asylum. It seems like as a refuge too. She's a great character.
She's an amazing character. When I did my research into, and of course it started near Charleston, at a rice plantation. Dervla was an Irish descendant of a very poor Irish family. She was illiterate, who had come to America as indentured servants. And of course, these indentures could last for a decade or 2 decades. She remembers vaguely that there were these older brothers and this father, but they're long gone. And she basically grew up with her mother. And both of them had a sort of gift for woods medicine, which everyone did then. And they were also, Dervla was especially good with women who were having difficult pregnancies. She was called upon to be a nursemaid. And they're forced to leave very suddenly in a way that the book describes. And she goes with both Eliza and her adopted son, who are lovers. They intend to get to Canada, but they're unable to go that far, and they end up in the very highest reaches of the Allegheny Mountains in West Virginia. And Dervla, she's an amazing character because she has such a sense of intuition. People say that she's magic or she's a witch, but she's very clear in saying, there's nothing, I'm not a witch at all. I'm simply someone who knows how to harvest the right herbs, and but she is completely devoted to this little family. And though she has no power whatsoever, she continues to move things and affect things. And that's something that you discover in subtle ways in Night Watch. Right here? Okay, there.
So first, I would like to thank you so much for all the insightful knowledge you've given us today. I think I've learned a lot personally. So, all right. On that note, there are two quotes that really stuck out with me today. One of them was, history is written by the victors. And another one I believe you briefly mentioned was that there are a lot of uncovered stories in history.
There are what?
A lot of uncovered stories throughout history that often get overlooked.
Right. So much forgotten.
Right. So on that note, in historical fiction, I was wondering how you account for those lost stories that might have been overlooked, as history is often very selective. And as a writer, I was wondering how you account for all those forgotten stories when you're taking your creative liberties. And what is the balance that you're often looking for in the sense of creating an interesting story while preserving history, if that makes sense? So I guess in a simpler sense.
Well, it's sort of like balancing history with the fiction that you were creating, right?
Yes. So how do you decide which stories to include in your own story from history? And how do you preserve history while creating insightful stories?
Well, in all of my books that have a historical aspect, I stay very, very clear and very close to the history. Sorry. The history of the battles, the history of the asylum itself, are all true. But the perceptions that I create in the characters are all imagined, but they're imagined almost inside the world of those characters themselves. There's almost an unconscious world inside an organically produced novel, that is, a novel that grows up from itself. And I feel as though that creation almost underscores the history and makes it seem to us more real, as though we could have inhabited it.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Back at the asylum, is there data from the period about the efficacy of moral treatment? I know you've done a lot of research, and I wondered if there were good notes taken about how effective it was.
Absolutely. And actually, in the acknowledgments of the book, don't read it till you get to the end, please. I talk about some of those books. Sorry, I'm fighting pneumonia up here. Kirkbride himself wrote a very tiny book that is published in a very kind of story press or something like that. And that is his manual on how to build an insane asylum. There's also a book called Asylum Keeping that is about Kirkbride and things that happened to him in his life. And I used things that happened to the real Kirkbride as events in his nephew's life. Kirkbride actually did marry a patient. She was a gentle lady, patient. His wife had died. She was far younger. They married and had 5 children and were very happy together. No one, I mean, at that time, it was not that unusual, as we know, for a doctor to marry a teacher, to marry a patient, or a professor to marry a student. And Kirkbride also had an attempt on his life made by a former patient. And of course, if you've read the book, you know that this comes into play in Night Watch. So in a way, I'm almost pulling more history in, although it may be in the life of a different character. But my sense of the sort of like just the sensory worlds that these people inhabited is something that I got very, I think, close to and hopefully sustained for the reader. Thank you. Perfect timing.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Anne Close and Jayne Anne Phillips, for that extraordinary conversation. Thank you for reminding us that, yes, history gives us facts, but literature gives us the story. And thank you for that visual tour through the extraordinary world that you've created. We deeply appreciate it. 3 small housekeeping notes from me. Number 1, I promised Jayne Anne I'd take a picture of the sold out crowd. So can we do 1, 2, 3 Night Watch? 1, 2, 3. Again. Fabulous. Number 2, I'd like to thank again our wonderful sponsors for this event, Tom Taft and the fabulous Kathleen Paramore. And number 3, Jayne Anne Phillips will be available in our pop-up bookstore, Buxton Books official bookseller of the festival, in the pop-up bookstore at the back of the theatre. So if you exit out the back, there will be a signing queue, and you can meet with Jayne Anne Phillips, ask all your questions, have your books signed and personalised. And there are also books available for sale, so buy one for your auntie, your granny, and everyone in your life. That's the best holiday gift. Thank you so much for coming out to Charleston Literary Festival.
Thank you.
Thank you.